Hello and welcome to the Microbiome Medics podcast. I'm Dr. Shiv McCormack.
And I'm Dr. Sheena Fraser, and we're your co-hosts.
We are both GPs and lifestyle medics with a shared passion for microbiome science, and we have spent the last 5 years deep diving into the world of the gut microbiome.
We've been analysing the evidence, appraising the studies, speaking to the experts, and writing the Gut Microbiome for Clinicians e-learning course for the BSLM Learning Academy.
We have discovered that the gut and other human microbiomes are pivotal to every aspect of your health and physiology, and the pillars of lifestyle medicine hold the key.
So in these Microbiome Medic podcasts, we'll be covering the basics, bringing you the latest research and talking to the experts on all matters microbiome.
We'll be translating the evidence and packaging it into actionable, bite-sized chunks so that you can harness the power of the microbiome to improve your own health and that of your patients.
Right. Hello and welcome to this month's Microbiome Medics podcast. Today we're going to be discussing the next stage of gut microbiome development. In particular, we're going to be looking at the impact feeding choice has on the gut microbiome development early on in life. So looking at the decades of research that the WHO have done, they now recommend that exclusive breastfeeding for the first 6 months occurs, with continued breastfeeding along with introducing appropriate complementary foods for up to 2 years of age or longer. So despite this recommendation, the majority of infants in the UK are actually formula fed still. In fact, looking at the current statistics, 49% of infants are breastfed at the 6 to 8 week mark, but in Scotland, only about 28% of those were actually exclusively breastfed. And only 22% of infants in Scotland were breastfed until 13 to 15 months. So I couldn't even find any surveys in England beyond the 8-week mark. So it's a little bit worrying. But why do we find these figures alarming? Well, let's find out. I'm joined as always by my fellow gut spugs enthusiast Shiv, who's going to kick off today's discussion by introducing us to breast milk and what this amazing stuff does to the developing gut microbiome. Hi, Shiv.
Hi, Sheena. Thanks for that introduction. Lovely to be doing another podcast with you again. So I want to start off by talking about breast milk composition and what makes it so well suited to the developing gut microbiome of a newborn baby. Now, just to kind of recap on last month's podcast, we talked about how the vaginally delivered newborn is showered with mum's perineal microbes en route, and these microbes are from mum's skin, her vagina and her gut. They travel to the infant gut as pioneers, and they set up shop there and create conditions to attract colonization by other beneficial microbes. But these microbes need feeding if they're going to survive and thrive in this new landscape, and there's just 2 options on the menu, really. There's breast milk and formula milk. So let's start by having a look at breast milk. So it's easy to think of breast milk as just macronutrients. It's actually 87% water, 7% lactose, 4% fat, and about 1% protein. But it's not just about macronutrients. It's got numerous other benefits for baby and mum. Mustn't forget that it helps mother-baby bonding, and for the mother, it reduces risk of postnatal depression, cancer of the breast and ovary, maternal diabetes and obesity. So lots of good things for mum as well. But it also delivers a wide spectrum of biologically active molecules that aid baby's survival, growth and development, and can really impact long-term health as well. So the baby is very immune naive on birth and needs a lot of protection. And this is provided in the breast milk in plasma cells, antimicrobial peptides, immunoglobulins and cytokines. All these things protect the baby against pathogens and also modulate the gut microbiome as well. There's also things like vitamins and minerals, and we could talk a lot about what's in breast milk, but we're going to focus today on the third most abundant component in breast milk after lactose and fat. It's something called human milk oligosaccharides, HMOs. Now, these HMOs are complex sugars made by mum, but they're actually not non-digestible by her baby. The baby doesn't have the necessary enzymes to break down these HMOs. HMOs actually feed the baby's gut microbiome and boosts the growth of a particular type of bacteria called Bifidobacteria. So the HMOs are bifidogenic. They boost the bifidos. So there's a special subset of bifidos called Bifidobacterium Infantis, which is considered kind of the superstar of a healthy baby gut microbiome. So mum's really using these HMOs to select specific bacteria to grow in her infant's gut. Now, remarkably, there's over 200 HMOs identified to date. Now, each breastfeeding mum won't have all 200. It seems that a mother might typically have between 50 and 100, and this varies in depending on her diet, genetics, and their location. So why do we need to feed these Bifido Infantis, and why are they so special? Well, these bacteria are really good at using these HMOs and breaking them down to lactate and acetate. Now, these metabolites lower the pH of the baby's colon, and this is really important for deterring potential pathogens and also attracting beneficial bacteria which grow in a lower pH. They also boost the gut bacteria function, and it's really important to have a good gut function because you prevent bacteria in the baby's lumen breaching the baby's gut barrier and entering the body and triggering a pro-inflammatory response. Now, as well as this food for bacteria, the breast milk is also teeming with live bacteria. And it's thought that there's hundreds of thousands of bacteria enter the baby via the breast milk every day. Now, there's thought to be about 200 different strains of bacteria, and the names you'll hear mentioned again are Bifidobacterium, as well as Lactobacilli and Bacteroides. So these are all key. And it's actually been demonstrated that indeed breast milk does provide these bugs, and they do colonize the neonatal gut. Now, these bacteria are really important because they produce short-chain fatty acids, and this again is really important for the developing immune system of the baby and also for the baby's gut barrier. So if the breast milk is packed with live bacteria, where exactly do these bacteria come from? Well, it seems that some come from mum's skin and also from the baby gut during feeding, because studies have shown, interestingly, that the breast milk doesn't just go from the breast to the baby. There's actually a retrograde flow from the baby's mouth back to mum's breast and back from the breast to the baby's mouth again. So there seems to be this flow of bacteria. So it takes skin bacteria and baby's gut bacteria with it. In addition, in the third trimester of pregnancy, I know, Sheena, you mentioned this last time, that the maternal gut becomes much more permeable and leaky. And this allows mum's bacteria that are usually contained within her lumen to sneak across her gut barrier into the maternal circulation, where they are taken in white cells in the circulation up to the breast, ready for the release of the first breast milk, which is called colostrum, which is a very concentrated form of breast milk. So these bacteria are then ready in the colostrum to be injected into the baby's mouth. So pretty amazing stuff. So why all the bother? What exactly do these live bacteria in the breast milk do? Why is this so important? Well, as well as all the bacteria from the mother through the normal vaginal canal, these bacteria in the breast milk are also important colonizers of the baby's gut. In addition, they actually inhibit pathogenic bacteria. These bacteria in the breast milk actually secrete things like hydrogen peroxide and bacterocins, which kind of antibacterial weaponry. These live bacteria also aid digestion because they can break down lactose and other sugars. And they're also apparently really important for the immune system education of the neonate and the infant metabolism. So pretty astoundingly complex and remarkable, what actually breast milk does. So it's pretty amazing stuff. But hopefully in this modern day and age with all this research going on, formula milk must be pretty similar to breast milk by now. So how does formula milk compare, Sheena?
Yeah, thanks, Shiv. Well, I would love to tell you that it's a really similar formulation, but sadly there are lots of differences that make formula milk a little bit less suited to our infant's gut microbiome. Of course, the gut microbiome is quite a recent discovery, and we're only really now thinking about the impact that formula feed has on it. So when they first derived formulas for infants, this was, well over a century ago. They looked at what the infant needed nutritionally, and they tried to match the formula to the breast milk nutritionally. So, of course, they looked at the quantities of fats, they looked at the quantities of sugars in there, and they looked at amino acids and proteins within the milk, and they tried to match that up. And so they took a sort of base of cow's milk or soy milk, and they tried to sort of manipulate that milk to add additional amino acids, because there weren't enough amino acids in that formula compared to a breast formula. They added some vitamins and some minerals, so vitamin D is added. Things like folate are added to breast milk, and they try to make it as similar to breast milk as they can there. So they've done a lot over the years to try to make formula milks really similar to breast milk, but I think what they didn't realize until recently was all the immune side of things within the breast milk, and everything that you've discussed, Shiv, about the immunoglobulins, all the immune cytokines and things that are getting into the breast milk that are helping to train the infant's immune system. And then in addition, the HMOs, which are completely absent from cow's milk, and the probiotics, the beneficial bacteria, which again are completely absent from standard formula milks. And sadly, because it's lacking that kind of immune cells and those kind of important aspects, it does make for a very different infant journey. And sadly, when we look at the impact that has on the immune development of the infant, it's clear that these infants don't have the same immune development as the breastfed infants do. There's a very big difference in the composition of the gut microbiome when you look at it. So a formula-fed infant won't have the same quantity of bifidobacteria, which the breast milk helps to encourage. Instead, the formula-fed infant has more Clostridia, and Clostridia are more harmful as organisms. And there's less short-chain fatty acid production because you're not getting the HMOs, and you're not fermenting the HMOs in the large intestine, and so you're just not getting the production of short-chain fatty acids that you would do normally. The pH of the gut microbiome is different because you're not getting that acidic short-chain fatty acid production. So it's a much higher pH, and as such, it will encourage more of the pathogenic and harmful strains of bacteria within it. So it's a very different composition there. In addition, when we look at the long-term outcomes of babies who are breastfed versus babies who are formula-fed, we know that the formula-fed infants actually have a much higher rate of allergies and things like asthma and hay fever, that atopic likelihood. And also they have a much higher incidence of obesity and some chronic diseases as well, including heart disease and diabetes and things. So all of this is important, and I think up until now, and I think even now, this isn't a discussion that we're having with parents to be or mums and around the feeding choice. We're not having this discussion yet, but this is something that I think we need to certainly think about. So because formula feed is an inferior product, it does mean that the companies are now thinking about this and what they can do to then manipulate the formula feed to make it a little bit more similar to the breast milk now. So Shiv, do you know how the companies are responding to this research, and do you know what the current research is happening within formula feeds? What can you tell me about that?
Yeah, thanks, Sheena. I just want to say, first of all, just that there's obviously a big global movement to promote breastfeeding. And I was unaware until about a couple of years ago that the UK has got one of the lowest breastfeeding rates globally. I think that's pretty amazing to hear, really. And if you add to that the fact that UNICEF launched a big campaign directed at the UK to try and improve our breastfeeding rates, it really is something for us to consider what it is about the UK that makes us have some of the lowest breastfeeding rates in the world. There's also, I know the sort of medics among you will be aware that there's been lots in the medical press about advertising of formula feeding and trying to sort of clamp down on advertising, certainly in medical magazines such as the BMJ. And, there's sort of a big movement to try and promote breastfeeding. It's complex, though, because obviously we are aware that many people listening have been breastfed or chosen to breastfeed their babies, but other people, for personal reasons or medical reasons, have had to formula feed. And it's really important. This is non-judgmental. There's lots of reasons why people might do this, and everyone has got to make their own decision based on the evidence they're presented with. So certainly the formula milk manufacturers are desperately trying to improve prebiotics and probiotics in formula milk, but they're not doing brilliantly. Now, I'm going to ask you, Sheena, in a moment. As far as I'm aware, when I last looked, there were maybe, when we say that breast milk has over 200 potential HMOs available, as far as I'm aware, in formula feeding world, they had managed to provide, I think, a couple of HMOs in formula milk. And I know there are some formula milks that also have live bacterial probiotics, but I think, I'll pass it to you, Sheena, but I think there's lots of issues about the safety because, or whether those probiotics actually survive in formula milk. I know you've read a bit more about it, Sheena. Can you enlighten me?
Yeah, so you're right. I mean, when they've put HMOs into formula feeds, they're certainly not getting the numbers of HMOs that you would get in the average breast milk. Of course, breast milk will vary from individual to individual. And actually, it's worth pointing out that the quality of the breast milk, the amount of beneficial HMOs, probiotics, and also immune cells within the breast milk is very different from one person to another. And that will be very dependent on that mother's lifestyle and their own diet. And in fact, if you consume probiotics yourself as a breastfeeding mother, you'll actually produce more probiotics within your breast milk, which is interesting. But essentially, breast milk still contains a lot more of these things than companies have managed to get into their formula milks. So there are formulas that you can buy now that contain HMOs, and there are formula milks that contain a combination of HMOs and probiotics. And these obviously are trying to address the issues of not being similar enough to breast milk. And in fact, they have been successful in some ways. So when you compare the microbiota of the infants on the breastfeed and those on the formulas that contain the HMOs and the probiotics, and even the symbiotic ones that can contain both, there is actually a difference in the microbiota of the formula-fed infants. So it does become more bifidogenic. So there are more bifidobacteria within the gut microbiota. And interestingly, it does reduce the number of Clostridia and it does reduce the pH in there. So reducing the harmful bacteria is obviously going to be beneficial. And there is a higher short-chain fatty acid production, which will go some way to protecting the wall of the gut. And it, theoretically, it should influence the immune system quite substantially. And it also, there are other benefits, like when we look at dendritic cells. Dendritic cells are important in the regulation of T cell differentiation and the development of our innate and our adaptive immune response to infections. And if we add HMOs to the formula feed, then that enhances the effectiveness of these dendritic cells. So in real life studies, when they've looked at infants that are fed these more modern formulas, they have noticed that there is a reduced rate of colic within these infants. But sadly, there's not enough long-term data on these products yet. So I guess the hope is that these products will help to reduce the rates of allergy, reduce the rates of atopy, but there isn't enough data on this yet. And the data that they've had is not shown a significant reduction in these conditions yet. So the current guidance is to stick with the standard formula, but I still wonder about the rationale for that, given the fact that there are very beneficial changes within the microbiota of these infants, which looks to me like it's heading in the right direction and perhaps a little bit more beneficial than not giving the additional things. But of course, there may be a cost issue with these modern formulas. And also, they're not quite as easy to give. So when you've got probiotics within a formula, these are live microorganisms. And if you add boiling water to that preparation, that will kill these microorganisms. And as such, you can only add water that is 70 degrees C or lower to the formula feed to make it up. So it's a little bit more of a fiddle because, getting the water to that temperature is not necessarily that easy. And that might be influencing its effectiveness if you're always adding the wrong temperature of water to it. So, it's not quite as easy to give and does require a little bit more thought around the preparation of that formula. So there are issues with it. However, there haven't been any safety issues with it. So the concern about giving live microorganisms to infants when they're very young and their immune system hasn't developed well, people were concerned about the potential for infections. But actually, there haven't been any signs of an increased rate of infections in these infants given these formulas. So they do appear to be safe. And there are some even more modern formulas which are looking at postbiotics, so killed bacteria within the formula milk. And these do seem to be giving benefits as well to the microbiota formulation. So there's pros and cons of these. And as I say, current advice is that they're not recommended, but they are out there. And I don't know if they're even being discussed out there by midwives and people who are influencing mums at the moment.
Yeah, so it's just interesting when you talked about influencing mums, because just going back to this idea of the UK being one of the lowest breastfeeding nations in the world, and that I just sort of, we're both GPs, and I don't know what it's like for you, Sheena, but I find that I'm getting less and less contact with mothers during their pregnancy and have very little chance to influence people or to tell them what the options are. I don't know, what's happening in antenatal clinics, but I used to see people on a much more regular basis. It seems much more fragmented, the care at the moment. Just on a personal level, I did breastfeed both my kids, but not really because of health reasons. It was actually just because I had this brilliant midwife who I discussed on the last podcast, who just made it so easy for me and actually taught me how to breastfeed. And I think there's this idea that because something's natural, it should be easy, but that's just not the case. I think we can say that, for example, delivering a baby is natural, but not necessarily easy. And I think having these brilliant people around, these kind of breastfeeding, people who know what they're doing and are able to advise mums, I think can be incredibly helpful. And I just don't think there's people like that around on busy wards anymore. Certainly, I came from a background, my mum was a busy nurse, and when she had me, she desperately wanted to get back to work to pay the bills. And also it was a time when formula was seen as new and modern and, probably better than breast milk, sadly. That was a sort of background when formula was introduced, that it was actually not only as good, it was better, and it gave the working mum a lot of, help, if you like. So it's kind of interesting. I don't know what your personal experience is, Sheena, if you're happy to talk about that.
Yeah, thanks, Shiv. I had a very different experience to you. I have 3 kids and I breastfed all 3 of them. But I did so, I was pretty determined to breastfeed, actually. And the reason why I was pretty determined to breastfeed is because one of the first projects I did at medical school was comparing breast and formula milks. And obviously back in those days, it was purely about the formulation. And I realized there was a big difference between formula milk and breastfeed, even way back then. And that was without knowing anything about the gut microbiome. So I felt very strongly about breastfeeding, but that's not to say it was easy. And I have to say I didn't have a very easy start because my first child arrived 6 weeks early. In fact, I went into labor when I was doing my afternoon surgery one afternoon, and promptly gave birth to her within 24 hours of that episode, and was sort of left a little bit shocked by the whole situation. And a midwife walked into my room and handed me a breast pump and said, "There you go, go and pump some milk." And I was like, "Oh my God, what do I do with that?" And I was quite taken aback. So I gave it a go and was quite surprised to get about 10 mils out of both breasts. And then I took that promptly along to the special care baby unit. And my baby couldn't latch on at that stage. She was too early. And she had to have a nasogastric tube put in, which is a little feeding tube through her nose. And so I had to feed her through this little feeding tube, and I had to pump breast milk every 3 hours. And I dutifully did it for the first sort of 7 to 10 days. And then we tried to get her to latch on at that stage. And I was really fortunate that she did actually latch on fairly well, and it was a little bit easier after that. Although I have to say, what people don't talk about with breastfeeding is things like when your infant is trying to build up your supply, and you can literally be sat for hours whilst they're feeding away, and it's really exhausting. And of course, when you're breastfeeding, you're your partner's pretty sort of a bit of an accessory, really, and doesn't really have a lot to do. So it was, very tiring for the first, certainly for the first 6 to 8 weeks of breastfeeding. And then once things are established, I would say that's when you reap all the benefits. And certainly where I thought I really reaped the benefits was when my daughter was 9 months old and she was really ill, and she was taken into hospital. And she had a pneumonia, and she was so unwell, and she was on oxygen, and I was really worried about her. And she went completely off food, and the only thing she would accept was breast milk, because I think it was so comforting for her. And I was just so glad that I was still breastfeeding at 9 months, because it was the only thing she wanted. So I certainly reaped the benefit then. So that's my own experience. As a GP, sadly, we don't get to see mums enough, like you're saying, Shiv. I may see somebody in pregnancy if they have complications in pregnancy, but other than that, I generally don't see them at all to talk about breastfeeding and to influence them in any way. And then the first time I'll see them was for their 6-week check, by which stage often breastfeeding is either established or not. And of course, more often than not, it's not established in this country because so few people breastfeed still. So by that point, we've missed the boat to have any influence on mums. I do offer my own personal experience to other mums, and I do try to encourage people to breastfeed, knowing all the benefits, and especially now, knowing the impact on the gut microbiota of their developing infant. I even talk to them about that now. But it's a different time. And I think, the influence needs to come from the obstetrician and the midwives that have the greatest amount of influence around them, I think. So that was my experience. I think from now we're going to move on to the article, research article that you've been looking at, Shiv. What were you looking at this week?
Yeah, well, actually, it goes nicely from what you've been talking about. Quality, that's the word you mentioned. And I think this is really important because there is concern that, over time, the last 100 years particularly, that because of cesarean sections and because of formula feeding and because of liberal use of antibiotics in the perinatal period, that actually there is a reduced quality both of our maternal gut microbiomes and our breast milk and the HMOs we produce and the bacteria, the beneficial bacteria we have in them. So this bit of research I found, I think you'll like. The reason, just briefly to say, the reason why we think it's important to discuss research papers is it can seem really separate what goes on in universities and research laboratories and very unconnected to us, in general practice and primary care. But it's really important to sort of understand how these researchers, who are in fact real people, actually do research on real people. And I think microbiome research is complex enough in the laboratory using animal studies or culture studies, but it gets really complex when they try and do microbiome studies on humans, and trying to get, human beings to follow strict study protocols can be very chaotic. So just to recap before we move on to the paper, this B. infantis is considered the superstar of a neonatal gut microbiome because it's good at digesting these breast milk HMOs, and these breast milk HMOs produce lactic acid and acetate, and these do a number of things, but they lower the pH. Now, you've mentioned it several times, and I hadn't been aware until recently how important this lower pH is. And again, over the last 100 years, the stool pH of our neonates has gradually been rising and getting more alkaline. Now, why is that a problem? It's a problem. We want a low acidic pH because it deters pathogen and it favours the growth of beneficial microbes. So a rise in pH to more alkaline pH, actually, pathogens like that pH and beneficial microbes don't. So it is a problem. So we think that the Bifidobacterium Infantis in infant guts has dramatically declined over the last 100 years. And a research group at UCLA in America actually analysed 14 large clinical studies of babies' gut microbiomes from 1926 to 2017, sort of looking at the pathogens and the bacteria in babies' guts. And they did find a massive drop in Bifidobacterium Infantis and a rise over the last 90 years in pathogens. And a rise in the pH of the baby's stool. So if we're talking about the quality of our gut microbiomes reducing and also the quality of our breast milk probiotics and prebiotics reducing, then what can we do? Is it all doom and gloom, or could we actually rewild the neonatal gut microbiome? So this is what was examined in this paper that I've chosen. So it's American researchers at UCLA again. And it was published in 2022 in Pediatric Research, a group under Claire O'Brien, Early Probiotic Supplementation with B. infantis in Breastfed Infants Leads to Persistent Colonization at 1 year. So this is actually a 2-year follow-up to an original RCT called the IMPRINT study. Now, to explain this to the listeners, Sheena, I'm going to enroll you on this IMPRINT study, which started 2 years ago. Imagine you had just delivered your baby by normal delivery. You're planning to breastfeed. The researchers ask you if you would like to be in this study, and you agree. They're trying to find out if beneficial live bacteria given to breastfed neonates actually colonize the baby's gut, or do they just pass through and don't really do anything? So this initial study that you are enrolled in, Sheen, is a 2-month study. So it took 68 mother-baby pairs, and you're one of them. So they're all healthy, full-term, vaginal delivery. And they were randomized into 2 groups. One group breastfed. The other group was breastfeeding plus a probiotic supplement with B. infantis. Now, Sheena, you have been randomized to this second group. So you're breastfeeding, but your baby's also going to receive this probiotic supplement. So both groups get the same breastfeeding advice, and the research paper says they have lactation consultants, which sounds fantastic and exactly what we need in the UK to teach everyone how to do this wonderful, wonderful thing. But Sheena, you also get extra tuition on how to add the probiotics. So you have to learn how to express breast milk, and you mix in the probiotic. And you syringe up 5 mils of the solution, you syringe it into your baby's mouth. So I think it's always good when we consider probiotics to actually consider them in the same way that we do medications. So think of them in terms of you need a dose, you need an indication, a dose, a frequency and duration. So the dose schema of the probiotic that you're going to be giving your baby it's in 5 mils, is 156 milligrams of live bacteria. So that's, 1.8 times 10 to the 10 colony forming units of live viable bacteria. So you are syringing this once a day into your baby's mouth from day 7 to day 21. Then you stop. So after that, no more probiotics, no more B. infantis is given. So the results of this initial study showed that probiotic supplementation with B. infantis in 7-day-old breastfed infants until 21 consecutive days resulted in the following. So this was comparing the group you were in, Sheena, with the group that just breastfed. So in your group, there was 7 times the level of Bifidobacterium Infantis. There was a 79% increase in fecal bifidobacteria of all types. There was a significant increase in gut microbiome metabolites like lactate and acetate, an 80% reduction in gut pathogens, and importantly, a reduction in fecal pH of the baby. And we know that this deters pathogens and favours beneficial microbes, and also reduction in gut inflammatory markers. So they concluded that giving breastfed infants additional B. infantis restores the gut microbiome composition and function to historical norms observed a century ago. So the paper we're going to talk about now is just a quick continuation of that. So you've had your first part of your RCT, and then the researchers say, Sheena, would you mind staying on for the next part? Now, not everyone stayed on. There were 68 people in that original study, and 68 mother-baby pairs. And about 50 said, yes, they would continue for the next stage. And the researchers wanted to find out, does this colonization with Bifidobacterium Infantis persist beyond the first few weeks? And they looked up until 12 months. So, Sheena, what you had to do was you had to do a detailed health questionnaire, and then you had to provide your baby's stool every 8 weeks until the baby was 1 year old. So you had to keep the samples in the freezer again, and then they were collected and analysed. Then there was a second part, which is probably more important, because it's all very well saying yay or nay to whether the B. infantis stays and colonises the baby's gut, but what's the point unless it does something beneficial? Now, from the studies we've been talking about, we've read about, we are hoping that having B. infantis and other brilliant microbes in the baby's gut are really good for the baby's short, intermediate and longer term health. So the second part was actually looking at health conditions of your baby. So they sent you a really long questionnaire, 18 months and 24 months as well. So they asked you about health and doctor's visits and outcomes, gut issues, allergies, asthma, eczema, whether your baby was going to, daycare. But also remember, at this time, there's a really divergent infant feeding style. So you may choose to feed your baby for over a year, but other mothers will be doing mixed feeding with formula. Some will be doing total formula. Some will be introducing weaning, usually from 6 months onwards. But, the type of weaning is going to make a big difference. And the other thing, of course, is that antibiotics and other medications may be given to the baby as well. So, it starts to get really complicated. So in answer to the first question, does the Bifidobacterium Infantis that was given in this original supplement, remember it was only given from day 7 to day 21, persist in your infant's gut beyond the 2-month period? The answer is yes. So in your baby, Sheena, at 6 to 12 months, your Bifidobacterium Infantis was between 2.5 and 3.5 times higher than compared to the control group, which is the group of women who just did breastfeeding. But there was quite a variation. So it was particularly high in people who continued solely breastfeeding. Now, if you either mixed in, you either changed to formula completely, or you mixed breastfeeding and formula feeding, or if your baby required antibiotics, then there were much lower levels. So according to the study, the levels of persistence after supplementation in your infant, depended on the type of feeding and whether you had antibiotics or not. Then the second part of the question was, does this make a difference to your baby's health outcomes? And the answer to that was no. There were no significant differences in the rates of asthma, eczema, atopy between the breastfeeding group and the breastfeeding plus supplement group. But there was a slight reduction in constipation, but nothing else. But you've got to remember that we're talking really small numbers here. So, the numbers here were about 48, and half of those are breastfeeding, half of them were breastfeeding plus supplement. So you really, and everyone's doing all sorts of things. So it kind of dissolves into chaos at this stage because you've got, 3 or 4 mums doing one thing and 3 or 4 mums doing another thing. And it gets really difficult to have the sort of, it's underpowered, basically, the study at this stage. But pretty interesting that it does colonize and it does stay. So what are your thoughts, Sheena, based on your own personal experience as well of, baby needing antibiotics?
I know. The sort of probiotic issue, it's really interesting. It's really interesting that over generations we've sadly lost so much of this Bifidobacterium Infantis. And obviously it is really beneficial to the infants in terms of its short-chain fatty acid production and lowering pH and protecting the gut wall. But it's interesting, this study, because of course, even if you don't have Infantis, you may have other Bifidobacterium in there. And what's to say they're not just as good at protecting us from, all of the sort of chronic things like the atopy and allergies and things like that. And so, it is interesting, this study, but as you say, it hasn't really given the clinical outcomes that are that impressive. But what is interesting is the fact that when you give it just for a short period of time, your gut microbiome seems to accept it very readily. And the fact that it can then be found a year later in the infant's gut is quite an interesting finding, because my understanding with a lot of probiotics is that they didn't really generally survive. But of course, we're continuing to feed it the right feed with the HMOs through the breast milk in the majority of these infants. So that's probably why it was surviving so well. It's really interesting. And the other thing I was thinking while you were talking about this was the fact that there will be quite a variety of different maternal diets and maternal lifestyles in amongst this. So of course, the number of Bifidobacterium and other beneficial microorganisms in the actual breast milk will vary between each individual mum, depending on their diet. And sadly, we know that the American diet is very, very high in ultra-processed foods and non-healthy foods. Really, it's the sort of whole food diet is very is quite a rare thing in America. And so the likelihood is that the majority of the mums will be on quite low fiber diets. And I wonder whether that is having a big influence on the quality of the breast milk that we're now producing. I would be interested to know what the quality of breast milk is like between people with very, very different diets like that. So have you heard anything on that, Siobhan?
No, I suppose, there's just so much more research to be done, isn't it? That's always what we have to say, more research needed. But it's just this, we need, you need huge studies, don't you? Not this kind of, tens of mums, but, then you get problems with funding. Where's the funding going to come from? And then you get into this, well, if the funding comes from probiotic companies or formula companies, then that's going to be tainted with a kind of, big food, big pharma, big probiotics. Everyone's, it's going to be people concerned about the financial incentives for various studies. So it is really difficult because on the other hand, we have got this issue with poor quality gut microbiomes, and that we're passing these on from one generation to another. And I suppose my overall feeling is one of hope, that I love this idea that we can potentially rewild the human gut, and that possibly then that improved gut microbiome could not only affect that infant's short, intermediate and long-term health outcomes, but that, if it's a female infant, could then be passed on to the next generation and the next generation. And that feels really hopeful and really interesting.
Excellent. Well, thanks so much for that. It's a really interesting study. So I think that's us for today. As always, if you found this episode interesting, please take a look at the Gut Microbiome for Clinicians, an online course on microbiome science, takes you through all of the important stuff. It's available on bslm.org.uk. Till next time, that's us. Goodbye.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Microbiome Medics podcast. We really hope you enjoyed the content and we welcome your feedback. We'd love to hear any suggestions you might have for microbiome topics that you'd like us to cover, and we also appreciate listeners' questions and will endeavour to answer them in the next podcast.
So if you want to progress this learning further, look at the Gut Microbiome for Clinicians. It's an online course on bslm.org.uk, which will take you on a much deeper dive into the gut microbiome.